Corporation, Filma Properties, DuPont, and Rolls-Royce. He has written more than 10 books in economics, management, and values education. Some of them are here with us. He has served 5 Philippine governments in the area of investment promotion and industry policy formulation. He does roadshows, and in fact, he just came from a roadshow organized by the Philippine Embassy in the United States, where he talked about the state of the economy of the Philippines. He's currently the research director of the Center for Research and Communication, and he's a visiting professor of the Yesel Business School, which is one of the top business schools in the world. So please help me welcome Dr. Bernardo Villegas.
Thank you, Oliver, honorable members of Congress. Let me say that I will talk first of all about how the Philippine economy is going to be among the fastest growing economy in Asia in the next 20 years. And I'm going to cite outside sources so that they will be independent, not more or less propaganda. In fact, this morning, probably you know that there was a big conference in the settlement where all the members of the cabinet spoke about the economy. And of course, businessmen expected that they would get propaganda. What do you expect the government to do? But what I'd like to do is talk from an independent point of view about how the economy is growing precisely because we have a large population. And please. Yes. So the title of my presentation is The Philippine Economy Reaching the Tipping Point. Probably you've read a bestseller several years ago called The Tipping Point. That's a management concept. And my hypothesis is that finally, after 26 years of very slow, painful, political, market, financial, social reforms, the Philippines has reached a critical mass of these reforms that now we're at a tipping point, ready to grow in the same way that China, India, Vietnam have been growing over the last 10 to 20 years. And I am not the one saying it. The first group that has announced it at the beginning of this year was Hong Kong Shanghai Plan. I'm sure you all read that report from HSBC that by the year 2050, the Philippine economy will be the 6th largest economy in the world, surpassing Australia, Thailand, Indonesia, and other countries that are ahead of us today. And one major reason why HSBC sees the Philippines growing is precisely demographics. That we have a large domestic market, which will be the source of a lot of investments, starting with Filipino investors themselves. Now, let's take a look at what's happening. San Miguel, Manny Pangilinan, Henry C., all these people are investing as if they don't know tomorrow. And they don't even need foreign money. Because as you very well know, the present financial system, and Congressman Apostol knows this very well, is oozing money out of its ears. Never in our history have we had so much liquidity. And at the same time, prices are low. Despite all this petroleum price increase, inflation is at 3.5%. So we are now in a situation where forces are realigning, just to talk in terms of planet Earth, that finally the Philippines is going to be among the dragons of Asia. And I will present very quickly the reasons why. So, well, but no, you will see the 7 to 9% in the 10 years. No. We don't have to wait till 2050. In the next, starting this year, we'll grow at 6 to 7%, and then accelerate to 7 to 9% over the next 10 years. But all of you will still be very, very active, either in politics or in the private sector. So growth rates of 7 to 10% possible in the next 10 years. This has been a result, and this is where I defend the Hong Kong Shanghai Plan forecasts from the skeptics. I'm sure you've read some skeptics, including former President Ramos, saying that he doesn't believe in akong Shanghai Bank. Well, from my own research as an economist, I think HSBC is right. Why? Because their skepticism comes from what I call optical illusion. They said, how is it possible that just last year, when the same listing was done by HSBC, the Philippines was only number 43. And then in 12 months, the Philippines is number 16. So what has happened over the last 12 months that helped the Philippines leapfrog from number 43 to number 16? It's impossible. Actually, they were accusing HSBC of being fortune tellers, no? They said, oh, that's part of this so-called, water dragon, all this soy. No, that's not true. Because, as I said, the 12 months now optical illusion. This situation is a result of 26 years. First, Goya Kilos, restoration of democracy. You know very well what happened. Congressman Golez was very much involved there. She was able to overcome 7 or more attempted military coups. And thanks to her, we now have the legacy of one of the most stable democracies in the world, not only nation. Now, objectively, very little restructuring was really done during her time. Probably the most important was the re-foundation for financial stability, but it was just the merest foundation. Well, I don't have to elaborate on how difficult her cabinet was. They were throwing stones at one another, so just think of what happened to Jimmy Ongmin, etc., etc. So, I'm not saying it to criticize, but she had more than enough to restore democracy. Then came President Ramos. His greatest contribution was in liberalization, deregulation, and privatization. So, the start of market reforms. After 30 years of the wrong kind of strategy, inward-looking, import substitution, protectionist, ultra-nationalist industrialization, which was the cause of our coming from one of the most developed economies in Asia to the sick man of Asia by the time Marcos was leaving. The main explanation was not really corruption. South Korea was totally corrupt at the time. Malaysia was corrupt. Take a look at the levels of development. So I'm not ignoring corruption, but corruption doesn't explain the fall of the Philippine economy. It explained by stupid economic policies during the period of 30 years, where we followed the Latin American formula for economic disaster, which I repeat is inward-looking, protectionist, ultra-nationalist. This idea, kawawa kaming Pilipino, kakanin kami buhay ng mga dayuhan. That was our undoing. Now, thanks to the era of President Ramos, remember what happened to telecom? We won't be the number 1 BPO industry in the world. Were it not for all the broadband that now we have one of the most developed telecom facilities in Southeast Asia. And that started, you very well know, with a flippant remark of Lee Kuan Yew, who told the Philippine Chamber of Commerce and Industry, I understand 98% of you Filipinos are waiting for your telephone lines, and the remaining 2% are waiting for the dial tone. And you know that right in front of him was Tony Boy Coanco, who was chairman of the LTT. When Ramos heard that, he told Tony Boy, unless you interconnect with your competitors, your franchise is going to be taken away from him. See now what's happened. Privatization also of the energy sector. Thanks to their strategy at the time of BOT, in fact, PPP, right? The so-called private-public partnership, it's just a new label for what started during the time of Ramos. Build, operate, transfer, build, operate, own. And all of us are old enough to realize how the first years of Ramos were awful. We had 10 hours of electricity in Manila. And thanks to his strategy, of course, there's no free lunch. The energy is expensive still today because it was an emergency solution. A lot of those BOT projects, they were necessary. I'm not criticizing that. But they made energy expensive, and that's now what we are addressing through the long-term PPP. Then came ERA. Believe it or not, it was in those 2 years when a Secretary of Agriculture, Angara, said, enough with this false kind of industrialization. What we have not done over the last 30 years is building farm-to-market roads, irrigation systems, post-harvest facilities. And that was the beginning of real countryside and rural development. And to her credit, think of what you made about all the accusations against the last government. And I don't make any judgment. But under the 10 years of Gloria Arroyo, we were endowed with a higher level of infrastructure efficiency. Just think of the Philippine Nautical Highway. Think of the NLEX, SLEX, SEDEX. We wouldn't be talking about all these things without those 10 years of focus on bringing development out of Metro Manila to the countryside. I always cite, for example, that it was just 10 years ago or 12 years ago, it was impossible for someone with a family to go from Manila to Batangas, cross to Calapan in a roll-and-roll boat in your own car, then go to Rojas, in Negros Oriental, cross to Panay, and then cross to Zamboanga, thanks to the Philippine Nautical Highway. And again, to his credit, the president is actually bringing that even to a much higher level through the private-public partnership projects. More airports, more tollways, and thanks also to a very outstanding Secretary of Public Works and Highways, Dave Singson, we are now seeing all the farm-to-market roads and other rural infrastructures being expanded. In fact, I just heard this morning, he told the audience, please don't complain if in the next 6 to 12 months you will find traffic awful going to the countryside because there were so many construction projects going on. Well, that's the price we have to pay for wanting infrastructure. In fact, he said 90% of all these infrastructure projects have already been bidded and budgeted in the first quarter. So what the government did not do last year, in fact, I was very critical last year. I saw our government suffering from paralysis by analysis. They were just analyzing things, and so afraid of corruption. They didn't spend, as you very well know. And so what happened? Our GDP grew by 3.7%. Now, I'm glad that they're listening to the criticisms, and they say, we are budgeting practically 90% of what we have in the first 3 to 6 months. And so I see 2012 precisely growing at 7%. In fact, I'm more bullish than Secretary Madaranga, who's saying only 5 to 6%. I think we can do 6 to 7% this year. So that is what I mean by this is a result of over 25 years of slow and painful reforms. In the Philippines, democracy precisely can be an obstacle. Let me just give you one anecdote just to illustrate this. Just before the Olympics in China in 2008, I had occasion for professional and other reasons to travel frequently to China. So almost every 3 to 6 months, I was visiting Beijing. And I was so surprised. Every time I went there, in 3 to 6 months, the landscape was changing so rapidly because they were building infrastructures like anything in preparation for the Olympics. And so one of the government officials who accompanied me heard my remark and said, wow, this completely changed from the last time I was here. Then he said, without giving much importance, oh, very simple, Dr. Villegas. There were 300,000 Chinese here in this place. We just told them we have to build infrastructure, scrap, go somewhere else. So that's authoritarian leadership. They can do that because they're not a democracy. At the same time, I always tell this because it's a real contrast. At the same time, I come from Santo Tomas, Batangas. And we have been dreaming for decades, literally, that there will be the Star Tollway that would connect Calamba to Santo Tomas. I'm sure you know, for those of you who go to the South, you know exactly what I'm talking about. For more than 10 years, people were announcing, finally, Calamba exit will be connected to the Star Tollway by a 5-kilometer extension. You know how long it took? More than 10 years, inaugurated 5 times by 3 presidents. Once by Ramos, second by Era, and 3 times by Roilo. And what is the reason? Right of way. So many private owners, and I'm afraid to say some of them are relatives, refused and started charging. But our government, in my opinion at that time, some of you are lawyers, you know this very well, was just incompetent in implementing the law of eminent domain. Because that's a law, it's constitutional. If you have to do something for the public good, you take over private property. And that's not communistic, that's part of democracy. But our government was just so incompetent that it took more than 10 years for that 5-kilometer road to be built. I'm saying this precisely to show you why it took 25 years of slow and painful reforms for us to reach this critical mass, where now, finally, we can start growing at 7 to 10%. China has been growing at 10 to 12% for the last 20 years. Now, this year, they're very nervous. Congressman Golez was telling me that there was some news about China, but the most sad news about China in the economy is like, oh, 2012 will be very poor. We will grow only at 8%. In China, to slow down is to grow at 8%. But because they have accomplished 10 to 12% for 20 years. And I said, from that explanation, I completely support the HSBC forecast that by 2015, and I see younger people coming in, I think some of you will be around 2015. I think the younger people will be there. And well, just to brag, and just to brag, and also to ask you for prayers for my mother who just died 2 years. Yes, but actually it's partly also giving thanks to God because He gave her 102 years. No, so she died at the age of 102. She's the last of the Malbars, no, the children of Terminal Malbar. I say that because I may boast. No, with her genes, probably I will see 2050. No, but it will be God who will decide. No. Next, please. Now, these are the positive trends, very quickly. Stable democracy, I already mentioned that. Strong macro fundamentals, I will show you the figures, but just to anticipate, our inflation is 3.5%. Our deficit to GDP is one of the best in the world, 1.5%. I'm sure you know from your fiscal management work that the critical limit is 4% of GDP. If you go beyond 4%, you're in trouble. Now, just for you to know what's happening to Greece. Greece has had 14% debt GDP. The US has 12% GDP, so the US is one of the most irresponsible countries in the world. 12%. 12%, very high.
And they talk too much.
Yeah, the only reason why they can do that is at the moment the dollar is still the accepted reserve. And so all the countries are willing to lend to the US.
How about euro?
Well, the euro is weakening, I think, because precisely there are the bigs, Portugal, Italy or Ireland, Greece, and Spain that are in serious trouble because they overborrowed. The average of these countries in debt in fiscal deficit to GDP is anywhere from 10 to 12%, too high. And so really, we are now appearing as one of the models all over the world. Now, I'm not saying that we should keep it at 1.5. I'd like to see it at 3%. Because as you know, debt is not necessarily bad. As long as spent on farm-to-market roads, airports, etc. But sometimes we can overdo, as we did last year, the limiting of the budget. Now, labor peace. Have you heard of any serious strike in any corporation over the last 5 years? KMU is completely toothless. Why? In the last century, if you remember how these communist-inspired labor unions would even instigate the murder of executives. I remember I was working in Nestle, and some top executives were murdered in Korea by the leftists. Right now, completely gone. So, but read about our neighbors. Social unrest in China. China is going to be in trouble. Social unrest in Vietnam. A lot of strikes in Indonesia. So now the Philippines, again, is standing out for labor peace. Now, the fourth one is the most important, demographically. Educated, young, and English-speaking labor force. Congressman Pustol was talking about demographic dividend. The Philippines is still one of the few countries now in East Asia enjoying still a demographic dividend, which is the phase in the demographic cycle in which the labor force, especially of the young, between 18 to 65, is growing faster than the retired force. In other countries like Korea, Taiwan, or Japan, and China very soon, the retired force is growing faster than the labor force. And that is definitely a sign of danger. Because that means there will come a time when there will be so many people over 65 already retired, and very few people who are in the labor force, that they're going to be in trouble as far as the pension system is concerned. And not to mention who will physically take care of the old people. And that is why the Filipinos will be in Europe for a long, long time to come, even if we eradicate poverty in the Philippines. Because they have no alternative. They have to turn, especially the Filipinos, who are the ones who can give tender and loving care. And Filipinos, even though they can have a decent living here, will still opt to be abroad. Then, if you take a look at our geographic location, we're right smack at the center of East Asia. Also, it's the shrine. But in terms of logistics, anyone who wants to reach both north and south will locate in the Philippines. Because in terms of transport, the cost would be less than if you were in Indonesia, which is too far away from Japan or Korea, etc., etc. Then, silently, it's one thing I especially want the House of Representatives to realize, because many times we are misled by World Bank data that use gross domestic product for comparing different countries. Now, that is understandable because usually a country's GDP is the measure of its economic power, gross domestic product, which, as you know, is the measure of all the production going on in one country, whether or not it is produced by nationals or by foreigners. While gross national product is the income earned by Filipinos, so you subtract the income earned by foreigners, but you add all the income earned by Filipinos abroad. And as you very well know, in the Philippines, that's 12% of GDP is earned by Filipinos abroad. Those are $23 billion that they're remitting every year. Now, because of the use of GDP, the World Bank and other attention agencies have been reporting that our savings rate is only 20%. Actually, it's been 20% for ages. But they have not realized that in the Philippines, what is relevant is savings as a rate of GNP. And that is now 31%. And that explains why we are oozing with money out of the ears. Savings are coming from the OFWs. And that explains why banks right now, their biggest problem is what to do with their money. They're exporting it, especially the best accounts. As you know, the central bank has 1.7 trillion pesos in SDAs. And some people are saying that's a very unproductive use of money. It could build school buildings, classrooms, farm-to-market roads. And so there's going to be a debate going on. But the central bank has its own reason for wanting also to be segurista, as we shall see. Then, speaking of petroleum, the Philippines is not going to be as affected by other countries with the rising price of petroleum because petroleum accounts for only 10% of our energy use. And it's one time that to give credit and its due, we should say something positive about the Marcos dictatorship. So not everything done during Marcos dictatorship was bad. One of the good things that we did with the leadership of the late Ronnie Velasco was once we were hit by the first oil crisis in the early 70s, they immediately developed a strategy to make the Philippines less dependent on oil. At that time, do you know how much dependent we were on oil? 95%. And so thanks to the strategy that Ronnie Velasco followed, geothermal, we're now number 2 in the world. Hydro, biomass, natural gas. Our dependence on oil is 10%. And so that makes it less and less problematic for us go up. And that's why our inflation continues to be at 3.5%, despite the rise in the price of oil. Now, we can make that even less and less dependent on oil if little by little we can introduce solar, wind, tidal wave. These are still expensive, and I'm sure in some of the deliberations you have all the issues about the alternative sources of energy, and Secretary Almendras is not yet that aggressive in pushing this because they will bring our prices too high, especially electricity prices. And the demand of today is to bring electricity prices lower because we have one of the most expensive electricity rates in the region. And I don't have to tell those of you who are following the stock market, that have been having the stock market, we just reached the 5,000 level, and it's up. I mean, you're looking for corrections, but I will show you a chart. The Philippine stock market is one of the best performing, not only in Asia, but in the world. And finally, we are one of the emerging markets, and this is time now I can fully discuss population. Now, everyone is talking about emerging markets, starting with BRIC: Brazil, Russia, India, China. Now, I want to make sure you know what is an emerging market, because not every country that's growing is an emerging market. Because everyone wants to call itself an emerging market. No, there are two requirements to be an emerging market. One is you must have a large domestic market, meaning you must have a large population. Second, you must have rich natural resources. Now, let me remind you, in the last century, there were 4 tiger economies that captured the imagination of the world: Singapore, Hong Kong, Taiwan, and South Korea. In fact, they were so impressive that they were called miracle economies. I'm sure you've heard of the expression East Asian miracle. So those of you who were studying in UP then, under Dr. Jerry Sikat, Encarnacion, etc., we were taking Economics 11. No? That was the story of the last century. But they were never called emerging markets. What were they referred to? Newly industrializing countries, NICs, or newly industrial economies, NIS. Why? Because they were so small in population that had no impact on the world. At that time, Singapore was 3 million, Hong Kong was 4 million, Taiwan 15 million. The biggest was Korea, 20 million. There were very interesting cases of rapidly growing economies that did something miraculous. They eradicated poverty in 20 years. And that's why people were studying them. But they did not have any influence on the rest of the world. Now, the ones who are going to be growing at 10 to 12%, as you see, are China, India, Indonesia, the Philippines. They will pull the whole world with them because they are very large in populations and are rich in natural resources. What does Singapore have? Nothing, no resources. Hong Kong, Taiwan and South Korea were very poor in natural resources. But if you take a look now, I am focusing especially in Southeast Asia, and you will see the reason why, on what I call VIP. And I don't mean very important persons. It's Vietnam, Indonesia, the Philippines. If you put these 3 countries together, all of them large populations, they can compete with China and India in attracting investments. And so, if I may give a solid advice, spend part of your travel money getting to know Jakarta, Surabaya, Borobudur, etc. Get to know Indonesia very well, because that is where Filipinos can find a lot of partners in the next 20 years. The same thing with Vietnam. And we put these 3 economies together, it's 450 million consumers. More or less the same level of development. Now, those were the first emerging markets. The first emerging market was crafted by an economist by the name of Jim O'Neill, working for Goldman Sachs. And this was about 12 years ago. And the first ones were Brazil, Russia, India, China. That's why the acronym BRIC came about. But then, when I was teaching in Barcelona 4 years ago, and since I had to do road shows in Europe, I was telling Europeans, if you stop with BRIC, you would lose a lot of opportunities. Because if you look at the ASEAN, these are 10 countries that constitute 600 million people. The ASEAN should be equal and even greater than Brazil, Russia, India, and China. Take a look. In terms of population, the ASEAN, as one consumer market, is bigger than Brazil, Russia, and Brazil. Take a look at GDP value. Our GDP is more or less like Russia, not too far away from India. China is the only one that has a much bigger GDP. In terms of foreign exchange, reserves, our reserves are better than all except China. And in terms of GDP growth, again, the ASEAN is better than Russia and Brazil. So which means that the ASEAN deserves to be at the same level as BRIC. Now, last year when the BRIC leaders were meeting, they realized that they had no country from Africa, and they thought it was politically correct to include Africa. So they decided to include South Africa, but without offending the South Africans, so saling pusa. Take a look at their resources compared to the others. No? But it's not to say that South Africa is not a very rich country. So if I were to look for partners right now, I would look at South Africa first, because it is the most developed African country. No? Next week. Now, go back. No. Now, 2 years after BRIC was crafted, the same economist said, let's add 11 other countries that will also dominate the world in growth and consumer markets over the next 20 years. And those are the countries he added: Bangladesh, Egypt, Indonesia, Iran, Mexico, Nigeria, Pakistan, the Philippines, South Korea, Turkey, and Vietnam. Now take a look. It's not rocket science. What is the common denominator among all of them? Large population. In fact, the minimum is close to 50 million, South Korea. But all the rest, very large population. And you will note that in Southeast Asia, only the VIPs are there. Vietnam, Indonesia, Philippines. Singapore is not there. Malaysia is not there. There's so small population. But one mysterious thing is Thailand is not there. Why is Thailand not included? Thailand is 60 million. So theoretically, Thailand should be there. Oh, that's one thing you have to tell Congressman Tanman. Thailand was not included because Thailand was so aggressive in birth control last century that Thailand is going to be the first country in the world to grow old before becoming rich. Thailand is still a poor country, $4,000. Just to show you how poor it is, Singapore is $40,000. So it will take a long time for Thailand to get like Singapore. But now, its demographic profile is worse than Singapore. The people who are over 65 in Thailand, percentage-wise, is higher than that of Singapore. And you know how Singapore has been so frantic about its aging population? Well, Thailand has the problem of an aging society, but still at a very low level of development. And so Thailand is in trouble. People will not go to Thailand in the next 20 years. Their labor force will be aging. The consumer markets will be smaller because more and more old people will be joining the population. And you know very well that consumer marketing organizations always want young population for obvious reasons. Old people don't consume very much. In fact, sometimes I joke, the only industry that thrives when 30 or 40% of the population, like in Japan, are over 65, would be the false teeth industry. With all due respect to those of us who are wearing false teeth because we are over 65 at the moment. But that's it. That's what we have today. The Congressman and the company. They want the Philippines to follow the footsteps of Thailand. And by aggressively pushing population control, we may also age before we become rich. That's nothing I wish on any person or any nation to grow old before becoming rich. I hope no one of us falls into that tragedy. And that's what Thailand. Take a look. Thailand is peaceful. Next, please. Now, just to show you that in times of crisis like this, it is good that we are not so dependent on export for growth. Take a look at Indonesia. Only 24% of its GDP comes from export. The Philippines, only 31%. Take a look at Singapore, 200% of GDP of Singapore comes from export. Hong Kong, 194%. So which means when Europe is down, the US is down, and Japan is down, all of our neighboring countries that have high export dependence are going to be in trouble. And that's why this year, these countries will be in trouble, as they were in 2009. Actually, in 2009, only 3 countries in this region had positive growth rate. And I'm sure you know what they are. Vietnam, Philippines. Thailand had negative, Malaysia had negative, Singapore had negative in 2009. Now, another thing though that is also very interesting is take a look at China. China is only 27% dependent on export, which means China can recover growth by just encouraging the Chinese to consume more. Because the Chinese have been oversaving. The Chinese have been saving 50% of the GDP. And so now the government of China is telling Chinese, go ahead and be extravagant. Spend as much as you can on consumer goods. And little by little, the Chinese are actually becoming consumers. You just take a look at them now all over Asia. They're now the #1 tourists all over Asia. Just go to Hong Kong. And 90% of you will see there in the stores are from China. Europe, China are taking over everything. The same thing with India. India is not that export dependent. So the moment that the middle class in India expands, India will have its own internal force for growth. And again, that shows that population is an asset, not a liability. Next, please. Next, please.
Next.
Now, obviously, I don't have to tell you what our problems are. No? So these are very well known to you. Corruption, although we're doing something about it, let me just say that I really would like to see whoever gets hurt that there is that completely persevering campaign to fight corruption. I don't expect overnight successes. But I say this because of what I have seen in Indonesia. Indonesia does not have better macroeconomic fundamentals than ours. But Indonesia is investment rate already because credit rating agencies in the outside world were so impressed with what President Susilo Bambang Yudhoyono did in the first 5 years of his presidency. He was so successful in sending to jail top private executives and top government officials, including the father of his daughter-in-law. Can you imagine? This Balake was sent to jail. Especially because at that time, he had a feisty Minister of Finance by the name of Sri Mulyani Ingrati. A lady not too different from Kim Henares, no? I don't know whether or not you are very fond of Kim Henares, no? But Sri Mulyani Ingrati was like her. She was one responsible for sending to jail for corruption a lot of those top people. And people from the outside were impressed. 5 years. Unfortunately, this Minister of Finance made so many enemies that they ganged up on her, invented all sorts of accusations. She got fed up, she left, and went to the World Bank, where she's now vice chairperson of the World Bank. I say this as a warning to our president and his people that it is not easy to persevere, because in the second term of President SBY, things have been sliding. Some very important businessmen, especially by the name of Bakri, have again gotten more power, and so the fight against corruption has somehow diminished. So that's a lesson. It's not easy. You really have to be persevering. But at least the president has the next 5 years to do what President SBY did in his first 5 years. And that is the final ingredient in the critical mass. Once people from the outside see we're serious about fighting corruption, then they will come here in bigger numbers. Now, red tape bureaucracy is something that also is being addressed by our cabinet. in different structures, what is an opportunity. Higher poverty, I will elaborate on that. And that is mainly because of lack of investment in infrastructure in the countryside. And that's why the more we can invest in farm-to-market roads, irrigation system, the more we will fight poverty. And then there's nothing we do with the last item, vulnerable to natural calamities such as La Nina, earthquakes, tsunami, etc. We just have to pray, among other things, that the world does not end on December 21st, 2012. So I'm sure you saw the movie 2012. I don't believe in it, though. I think the world will continue for a long, long time to come. Next, please. Next, please. Just for you to know the figures, since an economist can just talk and talk and talk, I can show you figures. So inflation, as I said, is very low, 3.5%. Peso-dollar rate will fluctuate between 42 to 45. But if you ask me, this is a personal opinion, this is not a prediction, it will be closer to 45 by the end of the year. Because once all of these big-ticket items are implemented, our demand for imports will rise significantly, while exports will not really be growing too much. So there will be pressure on the pace of depreciation, which is good for our overseas workers. Because we keep on telling our overseas workers they're heroes, and then we will slap them with a strong peso. That's not the way to treat overseas workers, though. But that is the problem of balancing the two sides. Then our gross international reserves are historical high. You know, $80 billion, that's about 11 months of import coverage. What is required is only 4 months. But we have really brought it to a very high level in order to be very sure that we will not follow the situation of Greece, Spain, etc. As I said, my own forecast for GDP growth rate from 2012 is 6 to 7. Government is 5 to 6. Industry sector growing at 7, and services sector 6.5. Next, please. The financial market is the one that Congress Apostol is very interested in because of his exposure to banking. So you have the same forecast for inflation and peso-dollar rate. But our 91-day T-bill rate is very low, which means money is very easy. And even 10-year bond rate is 5.5. In fact, I'm sure you know that recently the government issued a $1 billion bond. For 25 years, they got 5%. Again, unthinkable in the past. Next, please. So this one. Okay, never mind that. This is the trend for the stock market. It's up. And you can be sure that, in fact, the stock market people are expecting the amount of money. It's hot money, let me say, no? So I'm not, but it's hot money. That hot money will double this year, from 100 billion last year to 200 billion this year. Now you have to know when to enter and when to come out, because hot money easy come, easy go. But at least right now, it's still coming in. That's why the stock market has breached the 5,000 level. Next, please. Now take a look last year. The Philippines was the best performing stock market in Asia. Indonesia, Malaysia, Thailand, Singapore, and Vietnam were behind us. Next, please. Now, this one. So these are the industries that, both in your own districts and if you are a businessman, to invest in. These are the industries that will grow double-digit over the next 20 years. Because in the parlance of the economists, these are income-elastic industries. What does that mean? An industry income elastic if GDP grows at 1%, if it grows at more than 1%. So for example, if in agribusiness, GDP grows at 1%, agribusiness may grow at 1.5%. So you multiply 7% by 1.5. So you will get a double-digit growth rate for agribusiness. And for all these others now, of course, mining, we have to ask Gina Lopez to be a little less emotional. But that's my opinion. I don't want to start the debate here. Triple T's, transport, telecom, and tourism.
Excuse me.
Yes, please.
Will I wait until, or can I interrupt and ask a question?
I'll finish. I'm almost finished. Infrastructures, automotive, consumer durables, IT-enabled and IT services, that's BPO and KPO. And we are now moving more and more towards knowledge process outsourcing. Logistics and retailing, just ask NBC how bullish that sector is. Healthcare and medical tourism, ask Manny Pangilinan, he already bought 8 hospitals, right? And he wants more. I think he wants 12 at least. Education, ask all the tycoons, they're buying universities. Not only the Chinese ones, but even the Bellosari's in group. Construction, real estate, we can ask questions about this later on. Then the 4 F's of consumer spending: food, fashion, furniture, and fun. Incidentally, we made this list 10 years ago. And so we antedated the slogan, "It's more fun in the Philippines." So we already used the word fun to mean entertainment and tourism. Next, please. Now, this was the list, a separate list prepared by the 7 foreign chambers of commerce. American, European, Japanese, etc. And their list is not too different from what our economists came up with. Agribusiness, business process outsourcing, creative industries, they put together all the industries that require Filipino creativity. Whether it's animation, fashion, furniture, music, etc. So that's where we Filipinos are supposed to have a competitive advantage over other Asians. Just to be facetious, I always say that probably we Filipinos should imitate President Noy Noy, partner with the Korean. Because the Koreans are very good in telenovelas and in hardware, Samsung, etc. While we have some of the best artists. We have Terry Spenpenko, we have all of these people that are actually all over the world. Now, if you put Korea and the Philippines together in entertainment, we will dominate the whole of Asia. We will beat Bollywood. Because Bollywood, the only talent is to shake their head, dance, and sing. While Filipinos have a multiple of talents in entertainment. So follow Noy Noy Aquino, partner with the Korean. Then you have manufacturing, logistics, higher value, mining, and then fine tourism. So, as I said, not very different from the first list. So I'm over now, and please.
Yeah, I'd like to take